Welcome. So Eric, here's the book.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic cover.
I know, that's true.
And it's 600 pages. So tell us in a couple of words what your reader needs to take away from your book.
Yeah. The book tells a story. It tells a story of a nuclear weapons accident in Damascus, Arkansas that occurred in 1980. And I use that story, that narrative, as a way of looking at the management of our nuclear weapons really since the first nuclear device was invented in 1945. And I hope to remind readers that these weapons are out there, that they're still capable of being used, and that there's probably no more important thing that our government does than manage them, because these are the most dangerous machines ever built. And I think this subject has fallen off the radar quite a bit since the end of the Cold War.
You chose the Titan II missile explosion. So why that particular explosion rather than the many other incidents that you catalog in the book?
Yeah. My interest in writing about nuclear weapons was sparked by, I spent time with the Air Force after I finished writing my book, Fast Food Nation, and one of the officers told me the story of the Damascus accident. He had been in a missile launch crew, and I just thought it was an extraordinary story. I had never heard of it. I could not believe what happened, and the more I learned about it, the more it seemed like it was a very good way to look at these much larger themes about nuclear weapons, about our strategy for using them, and about our management of them. It's a story in which a seemingly trivial event, someone drops a tool, leads to a potential catastrophe. The dropping of the tool damages an intercontinental ballistic missile, creates a situation where the missile might explode, and in this case, the missile had the most powerful nuclear warhead the United States has ever deployed on a ballistic missile. So it was quite a story, and originally I thought the book would be relatively short, and I was just going to tell that story, but the more I learned, the story got bigger and bigger, because then I have another narrative about the effort to make nuclear weapons safe during accidents, and another narrative about the effort to control them from a command and control point of view.
No nuclear weapon has actually exploded.
No nuclear weapon has detonated. Some nuclear weapons have exploded and spread plutonium, which is not a good thing, but not as bad as a detonation. The book is a critique of a lot of the management of our nuclear weapons, but at the same time, it recognizes that enormous technical ingenuity, great organizational skills, and a huge amount of personal courage and bravery are responsible for the fact that we've never had an accidental nuclear detonation.
So you don't think it's luck? It's the really...
And there's luck.
And there's luck.
And there's luck. I mean, if you think about the fact that we've manufactured about 70,000 nuclear weapons, and we've never had one detonate accidentally, that's incredible management. We've never lost one. That's incredible inventory control. We've never lost one to other people. But in this business, anything less than perfect is unacceptable. And there's no question that we've come close to having detonations on American soil. And the Damascus accident is only one of the incidents. Another accident I read about was the B-52 bomber that broke apart over Faro, North Carolina, just a few days after John F. Kennedy's inauguration. And that weapon came very close. I think enormous praise and credit must go to the weapons designers, must go to the ordinary servicemen, who I really try to write about at length. There have been hundreds of books written about nuclear weapons, and very few of them have been written about the day-in, day-out management. And there were people who risked their lives and lost their lives trying to prevent nuclear catastrophes. At the same time, there's inherent risk in having nuclear weapons that are capable of being used quickly. And as long as weapons are maintained in that status, there's going to be the possibility of one going off when it's not supposed to.
How worried should I be today about the possibility of a nuclear accident?
There's no question that the weapons that the United States has today are far more safe than the ones that we had deployed in the 1950s, even through the 1980s. And one of the narrative threads of the book is the effort to improve the safety of our weapons. And I focus on one engineer in particular who became vice president of the Sandia National Laboratory. His name is Bob Purifoy, who devoted his career to eliminating safety problems with our weapons. And it would be nice to think that he was hugely supported by the various national security bureaucracies in doing that. But it was a real battle. And there were others like him who believed in the need for safe nuclear weapons. But there always was this inherent contradiction between military demands of having the weapons immediately available and reliable, and then the more civilian need to not have one of them detonate on American soil. Now, I think that helped the military as well, not having them be dangerous. Getting back to today's weapons, they're much safer. The weapons themselves are much safer than the ones that were deployed, again, as recently as the 1980s. Right. But I do have some concerns about the contemporary management of our arsenal, particularly problems that the Air Force has had in recent years. In 2007, half a dozen thermonuclear weapons were loaded inadvertently onto an airplane. The plane was flown across the United States without the pilot realizing there were nuclear weapons on board. And then that plane sat on a runway for 9 hours unattended. So there were half a dozen nuclear weapons that nobody knew were missing for a day and a half. And that showed management faults that I think were extraordinary, because there were many steps along the way in which standard operating procedures and even common sense were ignored. The people who removed the weapons for the bunker never checked to see if they were nuclear weapons. They were never asked to sign any piece of paper saying that they were removing nuclear weapons. The security guys never checked as the vehicle went past to see if there were nuclear weapons on board. The crew that loaded the weapons never looked to see if there were nuclear weapons. The pilots never checked. And in that case, you could argue, well, the system worked. Terrorists didn't get the weapons. Rogue officers didn't get the weapons. But you shouldn't have 6 nuclear weapons that don't need to be signed for and that can't be accounted for a day and a half. Just this year, we have 3 Minuteman III wings. Just this year, 2 of them have been found to have serious safety violations, and their commanders have been relieved of command. The 3rd Minuteman wing that we have a few years ago lost communication with an entire squadron of missiles. That's 50 missiles, and they weren't sure why it happened. It turned out to be a trivial mechanical fault, but it's not good to be able to communicate with your missiles for an hour, and it raised the possibility that our command and control system might be vulnerable to cyber attack. So a lot of the problems that I write about in the book have been addressed. Right. But to say that the command and control issues have been solved would be a mistake, because with something like command and control, which is a process, it's never fully achieved. The safety record is perfect until it's not. We invented this technology. We have longer experience with it than any other nation. And I would bet that our safety mechanisms and our command and control mechanisms are superior to those of any other nation. Given those facts, which I do think it's true, it's quite sobering, the challenges that we've faced and the problems that we've faced. And at the end of the book, I look at the rate of industrial accidents in other countries as a measure of their proficiency in dealing with complex technologies. And I worry about Pakistan and India and North Korea, and should Iran get one of these weapons. A UN inspector, who became familiar with the Iraqi design for their nuclear weapon, which was never actually built,
right,
was quoted as saying he'd be worried it might detonate if it fell off of a table. And that might be an exaggeration, but these are very complicated machines, and you don't want them to go wrong.
Is your profession going out of business? And second, why do you continue to be an investigative reporter?
I think that the need for my profession may be greater now in this country than it has been in 100 years. The ability for people to practice my profession and be paid to do it is probably the worst that it's been in 100 years. The first thing that newspapers tend to cut are their investigative reporting units. This sort of investigation, I spent 6 years on this book, but at a newspaper, investigative reports take weeks, months. They can be legally, there can be liability issues. And as newspapers have cut back, I think that the investigative reporters are probably the first to go, and the celebrity gossip columnists may be the last to go. And so it is an endangered art, but in a democracy, I think it's an essential one. And my background academically is history, and so I've tried to combine those two, a sort of investigative reporting and the contemporary implications of what I'm writing about, and my academic background, and trying to relook at history that maybe hasn't been thoroughly explored. And I think this book combines those two.
Let me place you, if I can, in the situation where the Secretary of Defense calls you in and says, okay, tell me what you want me to do, given what you now understand about command and control of the United States nuclear arsenal.
Yeah. Let me preface the answer to that part of the question by saying I try very hard not to write rants or diatribes, and the books that I write don't end with a point-by-point political program. I do the best I can to allow the facts, as I see them, to speak for themselves, to write in as calm a tone as possible so that my persona and my cleverness and my ideology isn't at the forefront. What I'm really trying to do is take subjects I think are very important, that the mainstream media may not be addressing, and particularly to take very powerful institutions that are very secretive and provide information to the public so that decisions can be made on the basis of information and not on the basis of misinformation or disinformation. And I'm not necessarily even talking about the Pentagon here. I'm just as easily talking about McDonald's and their marketing versus the reality of how they procure their food. So for me, nuclear weapons is the subject of existential importance, and the book is just to remind people they're there and provoke a dialogue, not to impose my point of view. Having said that, were the Secretary of Defense to call me in and ask for my advice, which is about as likely as a meteor striking this building as we speak, I would say the first thing that we need to do immediately is spare no expense in the management of the nuclear weapons that we currently have. Make sure that those who work with them are trained to the max. Make sure that they have the testing equipment that they need. Right now, some of the testing equipment that we have for our nuclear weapons dates back to the 1970s. Really invest in that infrastructure immediately. high morale, people who are well compensated, the very best officers being encouraged to enter the nuclear field, as opposed to the nuclear field, particularly in the Air Force right now, seeming like a career dead end. Those are things that we could do within a few years. In a bigger sense, I'm a great believer that the fewer weapons possessed by fewer countries is better and safer, not just in terms of accidents, but in terms of the potential of a nuclear war. So we have had arms control agreements that are bilateral between the United States, first in the Soviet Union, and now with Russia. But I think we need to find a way to engage the other nuclear powers in arms control talks. And I can go off on all kinds of other specific things. But one of the important things about the book is about a very unnerving and unsettling subject. But having spent 6 years investigating it, I'm not overwhelmed with doom and gloom. I'm not apocalyptic. I don't think any of this is hopeless. And really, if I thought it was, I wouldn't have bothered to write the book.
The theme might be good people, very dangerous things, and a bureaucracy that you cannot trust. Is that?
Those are some of the themes. I'd say good people, well-intended, patriotic, dangerous things, and people's behavior in bureaucracies is not always their best behavior. Someone recently, I read the basic rule of success in a bureaucracy is better to be wrong than alone. And what Bob Purifoy, one of the engineers and Sandia people who I wrote about, who I think is a true hero, he was right about the problems with our nuclear weapons, but he had to pay a price. He had to be alone. He had to be a thorn in people's sides, and his career might have gone a lot farther if he hadn't ruffled feathers constantly trying to push for nuclear weapons safety. Another fundamental theme, I think, in the book is that we are much better at creating complex technologies than we are at managing them. And it's hard to anticipate what can go wrong, how it might go wrong. And if it's an automobile that breaks down, that's unfortunate. If it's an airliner that has some unanticipated mechanical flaw, that's tragic for those passengers. But with a nuclear weapon that goes wrong, the potential impact is almost unimaginable. And that's why we have to be extra vigilant with these high-risk technologies.
In very personal terms, what it was like to write this book.
Yeah.
To get up in the morning, go to your computer, try to get the documents, talk to people. So tell us your story.
It was an extraordinary challenge for me, but it was also endlessly fascinating. Nuclear weapons are the greatest national security risk to the United States, and they're the most important weapons in our arsenal. And for those two reasons, it's very difficult to get information about this subject. So I relied on documents that others obtained through the Freedom of Information Act. The National Security Archive is a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. that's done a terrific job of assembling such documents in an archive. Those were useful to me. I got some documents through the Freedom of Information Act myself. It took a long time to get them, and it took, a couple of years for things to arrive. But I also reached out to people who had first-hand experience in dealing with nuclear weapons. And many books have been written about nuclear weapons, but most of them have been written by Manhattan Project physicists or about those people. National security advisors have written their memoirs, but very few books have been written about the day-in, day-out management of our nuclear arsenal by the people who do it. So I really reached out to former members of missile launch crews, bomber crews, weapons designers, technicians, bomb squad technicians who, their job was to render safe a damaged nuclear weapon. And the stories they had to tell were absolutely fascinating. And this history, as I learned it, was amazing to me. I studied nuclear strategy as an undergraduate. I studied game theory. I felt like I was very familiar, compared to most people, about nuclear weapons. And yet, this research made me realize I was profoundly ignorant. So much of this information has only been available since the end of the Cold War. And I think in the decade after the Cold War ended, and maybe even still, people haven't wanted to think about it because it was such a great relief that that war ended without bloodshed. But a lot of important details and a lot of important information's been released. And I think this book is one of, is my attempt to get some of that out there to the public. I say in my source notes that this book, like all man-made things, is flawed and imperfect. And I tried. I really tried. I felt like I had some very crucial people who were very helpful in different areas. Mm-hmm. So by spending time with people who served in launch crews, by spending time with people who were in maintenance crews, by spending time with weapons designers, and never just one, but a group, so that I felt like I had the sense. I feel confident that the central arguments of this book are accurate. Almost all the facts are accurate. I really tried. I don't rely on unnamed sources. Any fact, the assertion that I make in the book, there is a source note and the document for it, but inevitably I did make mistakes. I wish I knew what they were, and I would love for readers to point them out to me. But you might challenge interpretation or my own view on a broader historical issue, but you didn't find any factual error that jumped out at you and thought, ah.
No, actually I didn't, but I also didn't look at every note. But, yeah. But your reader will find that kind of note-keeping in terms of what it is that you're saying, and I think that's a real contribution. You're going to make a movie of it?
I have no plans to do that. It was just, and again, it sure beats digging a ditch, but just putting together that story. And I mean, when I contacted the Air Force told me that all the copies of the accident report had been destroyed and that they couldn't give me a copy of it. And it turns out there are a handful of copies still, but I had to find it in a university library in Kansas. And so, quite honestly, the complexity of this subject, trying to get as many perspectives as possible on that accident. So I tell the accident from the point of view of the guy who dropped the tool, the guys who were in the Launch Control Center, the guys who were in Strategic Air Command headquarters in Nebraska. I try to tell as many perspectives as possible. That was so complicated to do that the movie of the book I will leave to someone else to worry about. And it's an extraordinary story. It's an extraordinary story, I think, of great personal heroism. I would single out William Stevens, who was a safety engineer, who did some really pioneering work in trying to figure out how to make sure nuclear weapons won't detonate in abnormal environments, like a plane crash, a fire, if they're dropped, if there's a short circuit. Bob Purifoy, who was a vice president of the Sandia National Laboratories, who, as I said earlier, really risked his career for years to champion making our weapons safer. And you would never build a nuclear weapon in the United States today without the mechanisms that these gentlemen fought for years ago. But then, ordinary servicemen like Matthew Arnold, who was an explosive ordnance demolition technician, a bomb squad guy, guys like that who trained to walk over to nuclear weapons that were damaged and defuse them. I write about people like Greg Devlin and Jeff Kennedy, who were Titan II repairmen, essentially, who put on protective gear and went into a missile silo on the verge of explosion in order to try to prevent this missile from exploding when it had a powerful thermonuclear weapon on top of it. Again and again. There's another nuclear weapons accident that's gotten very little attention, but was a very dangerous one in Grand Forks, North Dakota, where a B-52 bomber caught on fire with 4 hydrogen bombs and 8 short-range missiles that had thermonuclear warheads. And the fire was being fed by the fuel pump. It was extraordinary that there were gale force winds blowing the flames away from the fuselage of the bomber, so that the weapons, weren't yet endangered, but they realized that the paint was beginning to blister on the skin of the bomber, and they had to do something. And there was a fireman named Timothy Griffiths, wife, small children, in the middle of the night. He puts on his silvers, his fire protective gear, climbs onto a burning bomber, gets into the cockpit to try to figure out how to turn off the fuel pump. And when he pulls the right switch, the fire goes out like the burner of a stove going out. Now, that is true heroism. And there were so many stories of that, even on the routine airborne alert flights that didn't have an accident. I mean, pilots and crews were putting their lives at risk on a daily basis in this country during the Cold War. And I think that their service and their heroism hasn't been recognized and acknowledged in the same way that the veterans of the Vietnam War now have a memorial, and the Second World War, and people died, and people, were injured during the Cold War in order to prevent a nuclear war as part of the process of deterrence, but also in handling nuclear weapons accidents. And so I try to honor the sacrifice of some of these people in the book and tell the stories of people whom I admire. I think that the secrecy that we had during the Cold War actually endangered us more than it protected us. In looking at the nuclear weapons issue, there was such intense compartmentalized secrecy within the government, not even, keeping secrets from the public, but within the government, that the people who were designing our nuclear weapons didn't know how the armed services were handling those weapons in the field, and the armed services didn't know some of the safety issues with the weapons that they were flying around and transporting. So the risk of a catastrophic accident was actually made worse by some of that secrecy. A document that I got from through the Freedom of Information Act that was 200 pages, a list of accidents and incidents with nuclear weapons, I showed to these Sandia weapons designers. These were the people designing our nuclear weapons, and they had never been able to see some of these incidents, which were hugely relevant to what they were doing in their designs. What's ironic in terms of this secrecy is throughout the Cold War, there's no question, the Soviet Union knew more about our nuclear weapons than the American people did. And that's absurd. Now, I do think there are things that must be kept secret. And in my book, I did everything I could not to have anything whatsoever in my book that could threaten the national security. And I had the book read by someone with a very high security clearance, an expert in nuclear weapons, not a member of the government, because I didn't want anything in the book that could threaten the national security. Having said that, and having gotten so many of these documents through the Freedom of Information Act, again and again, overwhelmingly, what had been excised, what the censors had eliminated, was not information that was going to threaten the national security. It was information that was going to threaten embarrassment for national security bureaucracies. So I would say we need many fewer secrets, much more closely held. When you have that many secrets like we do now, and that many people with security clearances like we do now, you have the potential for a Chelsea Manning or for a Snowden, relatively low-level people, to have access to secrets sometimes that shouldn't be revealed. And there have been periods in our history where there's been greater disclosure, and periods of our history where things have been held much closer to the vest. And I can't stress enough that this sort of secrecy endangers us more than it protects us. In the book, I go through a number of examples in which publicity about nuclear weapons accidents actually led to important safety changes being made. In the research for this book, I obtained documents that have been heavily censored that pertain to weapons 50 to 60 years old, no longer in our arsenal. Soviet Union no longer exists. I had no desire to reveal specific design details that would help anyone in Pakistan or India design a better weapon. But we need to know this history because we need to have a thriving democracy in which fundamental decisions about national security should be made by the American people and their representatives, not by a small group of policymakers acting in secret, which is about so much of our nuclear weapons policy has been made that way.
How did you go about your work for the book?
I'm unusual in that I don't have any research assistants. I don't even have an assistant. That may have also contributed to why the book took 6 years. I immersed myself not in thousands, but in tens of thousands of pages of documents. And I didn't read every word of every page, but with the search technologies that you now have, you can just pour through an enormous amount of material. And what I was doing is I was looking for little nuggets that might be within congressional testimony, that might be within documents that have been released through the Freedom of Information Act. I interviewed hundreds of people and read as many books as I could on the subject. And most of the hard work, the great bulk of the hard work, went into the research and then went into the structuring of the book, because I had a wonderful writing teacher who stressed to his students, John McPhee, that if you put everything you know about a subject into what you write, you don't know anywhere near enough about it. And you should leave out 99% of what you know. But that 99% is in between every line that you write. It's sort of like this book is sort of the tip of the iceberg of what I read and what I learned. And as a result, the real struggle was, well, what do I include? What do I cut out? And it's a very, I try to interweave these different stories. So researching the book and coming out with the structure and the outline was the most difficult part. Some of the writing was hard because I try to have a writing style that's very clear and simple. It's much easier to write ornate, complicated sentences. But this subject matter, particularly military issues, is so full of jargon and acronyms. And nuclear weapons are very complicated things, so the struggle in writing it was, how do I take it, these complex issues, and write about them simply and clearly without jargon? And that was a challenge. But it didn't go through 6 drafts. The version that's published is
pretty much your draft.
I cut some, but it's pretty much what I set out to do. And someone could argue, well, you shouldn't have set out to do that or whatever. But it turned out how I set out to make it, for better or for worse. One of the great things about not becoming a professional historian, which I thought about doing, and being a journalist, is that I actually get to see things happen. as opposed to just write about things that happened many years ago. And one of the most memorable experiences I've had professionally was watching the launch of a Titan II missile from remarkably close range.
I mean, you were there.
The officer who was my host had never stood that close to a missile while it was being launched. And we had our air packs in case there was a problem with a missile and it spewed some of its toxic fumes. And the reason I was doing this is that as I spent time with the Air Force looking into the future of warfare in space. And that's a lot of the people in the Air Force Space Command served in missile crews during the Cold War, and that's when I heard the Damascus story. So I'd heard the Damascus story fairly recently, and it was purely coincidental that I was getting to see exactly the same missile being launched, thankfully, not with a nuclear warhead on it, but with a weather satellite. Right. And they actually were very reliable if you had months to plan the launch, not when you had to keep them sitting in the silo, fully fueled. At any rate, I had this extraordinary experience of going up in the tower the evening before the launch and going right up to the missile, I mean, close enough to touch it. And it's like standing next to a huge silver 10-story building, really. And the next day, I was standing there on the hill, remarkably close, when that thing took off. And it was loud, and you felt the heat. And it was extraordinary to see this building rise up in the sky and fly up very fast. You could still see it. I was at Vandenberg along the central coast of California, Vandenberg Air Force Base, and you could still see the missile when it was over Mexico. And it happened quite quickly. And in watching that launch, I realized, and in a very deep, visceral way, that all these things I'd heard about the Cold War and these rockets and these missiles. I grew up during the Cold War. Part of you thinks, well, that's never going to happen. This is all stuff you read about. And it became very real. And I just saw in that moment, these things work. They really do. And in some ways, it's unfortunate. And this is something that a weapons designer said to me, Harold Agnew, who used to be head of the Los Alamos lab. You know, he said that every world leader should be gathered in one place and forced to watch the detonation of a hydrogen bomb. Because Harold Agnew has, and it leaves an impression. And that's I don't want to see one of these things detonate, but the last time the United States detonated a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere was 1962. That's 51 years ago. That means the youngest person to have seen one of these things detonate, probably in the early 70s. And the awesome power and destructiveness of these weapons cannot be conveyed by YouTube videos or written accounts. And so seeing the missile launch isn't like seeing a nuclear weapon detonate, but it was a pretty powerful experience. And it, in many ways, encouraged me to start this process that took years of writing this book and getting it into the world. I think that President Obama's speech in 2009 calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons, which seems like such a radical idea, actually harkens back to that post-war moment in 1945, 1946. This is a generation that saw tens of millions of civilians killed in war. The estimates vary, 50 million, 60 million people. During the Second World War, great cities devastated. And there was a great belief, firstly, to end war, not have any more world wars. And after the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a real conviction that the world had entered a new phase and that these weapons must be banned. So it wasn't just, you know, radical philosophers and peaceniks in the United States. It was some of our top military officials, Air Force and Strategic Air Command officers who talked openly about the possibility of abolishing nuclear weapons or putting them under some form of international control, and the growing rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, and particularly the behavior of Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, and their clear threat to the freedom of Europe made that an impossibility.
A couple more things that you want to kind of bring out of the book or the people. Are there any other heroes, people that you want to sort of talk about?
You know, I think one of the crucial themes of the book is again and again there's this feeling that things are slipping out of control. And there were all these different rivalries throughout the Cold War, not just the one between the United States and the Soviet Union, but between the different armed services in the United States, each one seeking access to its own nuclear weapons. There were rivalries between the weapons laboratories. There were civilian military disputes over who would control nuclear weapons. And you know, going back to what we said at the beginning, very well-intended people, genuinely patriotic, genuinely trying to protect the United States with different visions on how it could be best done. But these were very stressful decisions to be made, and the margin of error was very, very slim. Questions of whether we should try to protect Berlin in the different Berlin crises that we had. Would that precipitate a world war? So one of the things I write about again and again are civilians who think that they're experts on nuclear weapons, and that they're experts on our nuclear war-fighting strategies, finally getting into positions of power and being amazed when they get access to the single integrated operational plan, which was our nuclear war plan. And it's a recurring theme, whether it's John F. Kennedy's advisors who had come from RAND, who had written all kinds of theoretical works on nuclear war, and then when they actually saw the targeting, and when they saw the number of weapons that would be used, and when they saw the fact that this war plan, once it was begun, could not be stopped, they were stunned. But then, you know, years later, Henry Kissinger, who made his career as a nuclear weapon theorist and strategist, becomes National Security Advisor, gets brief on the single integrated operational plan, and is amazed at how destructive and how powerful. He does everything he can, and yet there's this ongoing tension that lasted really into the administration of George H.W. Bush between the civilians in the Department of Defense, who want to get control over nuclear warfighting strategy and targeting, and the officers in Omaha who actually control it through their computers and who set the war plan. And they, you know, they had a good argument themselves. They had seen, for example, how civilian interference with warfighting during the Vietnam War had been a fiasco. And, you know, the Air Force guys felt quite sincerely, well, it's up to the civilian leadership to tell us when to go to war. But then when we have to fight the war, we're the experts. So it wasn't really until the end of the Cold War that you had civilians in the first Bush administration making crucial decisions about the targeting and execution of our nuclear war plan. And that's pretty extraordinary. When Henry Kissinger went to Offutt Air Force Base, to the headquarters of the Strategic Air Command, to get a briefing on our nuclear war plan, again, he's the President's National Security Advisor. He's an expert on nuclear weapons. Details of the plan were deliberately hidden from him.
And he's the source of that. That is, he tells that story.
I actually think there are memos, internal Air Force memos, that mention that they're not telling him everything. We need to pay a lot of attention, and we need to spare no expense. We can argue about how many missiles we need, how many bombers we need, but if we're going to have missiles and we're going to have bombers, they need to be well maintained, they need to be the very latest that you can buy. I mean, right now, the bulk of our nuclear bomber force is as old as I am. I'm 54. You know, we have, I think, 100 nuclear-capable bombers. The B-52 bomber was designed right after the Second World War for high-altitude bombing.
Right.
And it's got all kinds of new electronics and avionics and new weapon system, but they have not built a B-52 since 1962.
Right.
And our Minuteman III, the launch complexes themselves are more than half a century old. And this is not a plea for building hundreds of new bombers or missiles, but there needs to be attention to the infrastructure, particularly to the command and control infrastructure of our nuclear forces. And I'm concerned about that with the cutbacks that we've had, not just because of the sequester, but also as they're looking for places to cut. The nuclear enterprise, as they call it, I think has not gotten enough attention. I think it hasn't been kind of a prestigious role, particularly in the Air Force, and we need to pay attention to it. And that's just a very practical, immediate concern of mine.
You've told a really good story. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And coming from someone who knows this field, that's a high compliment. Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you.